Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. I want to thank you for coming. This is a very special occasion because we have an extraordinary speaker tonight. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to give serious consideration to a point of view that I feel is very urgent and important at this time in American history. While you are drowned in political news, tonight I'd like to guide you to the solution to our biggest problem. Every day we experience how polarized our politics has become. It's probably fair to say that most people believe political polarization is our biggest problem. The Committee for the Republic disagrees. We believe our toxic politics is a symptom of our biggest problem, not its cause. Tonight, we're here to talk about our constitutional problem. We're here to talk about how and why our constitutional crisis is our greatest crisis. Now, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party's disagreements are not the cause of our constitutional crisis. Just the opposite. The cause of our constitutional crisis comes not from what Democrats and Republicans disagree on. It comes from what Democrats and Republicans agree on. While Democrats vote to spend $2.7 trillion a year on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and Republicans vote against it, both parties are bought lock, stock, and barrel by the military-industrial complex. Both vote $1.7 trillion a year to finance the largest military budget the world has ever seen. Now, what happens when you spend $1.7 trillion a year on the military? You have 800 military bases. You have alliances, military alliances all around the globe to justify forever wars. You get an imperial presidency to fight forever wars. You cease to be a citizen of an inward-looking republic that celebrates the rule of law and liberty and justice for all, and you become a subject of an outward-looking empire that celebrates the law of the jungle, where the strong do what they will and the weak accept what they must. Now, our violence abroad comes home with the militarization of our police and the militarization of our immigration enforcement. The sad and unspoken truth is that neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party is a party of the Constitution. We must stop denying this truth. The Democratic Party is not the party of the Constitution. The Republican Party is not the party of the Constitution. When Democrats and Republicans occupy the White House and control Congress, their allegiance is to their party, not the Constitution. Democratic and Republican politicians place their policies and programs above their oath of office. 2026 marks the 76th year that Congress has abdicated its war power. Lip service to the Constitution is paid by the party out of power until it returns to power. Almost 100 impeachable offenses have, by Democratic and Republican presidents alike, have gone unpunished. Congress has given away all of its 17 enumerated powers, except copyrights and patents. History's greatest political invention, separation of powers, lies in ruins. Our constitutional crisis will not end until a political party becomes the party of the Constitution. Make no mistake, our constitutional crisis is a crisis of leadership. This is no time for summer soldiers and sunshine patriots in defense of the Constitution, in defense of the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in the defense of the march of the mind over the exaltation of the armored knight. There's a great opportunity here for a Democratic or Republican politician to change their party into the party of the Constitution. Once one political party champions the Constitution, the other party will be forced to become a party of the Constitution. Now, since the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, the Committee for the Republic has held salons to educate citizens and representatives on the connection between what we do abroad and our political institutions at home. The committee is here to emphasize the supreme importance of constitutional process. And no one is more qualified to do this than our Vice Chairman, Bruce Fein. No one can better explain why the Constitution is the foundation on which our country rests. No one is better to remind you that it's up to you to restore our republic. Bruce is here tonight as James Madison to deliver the 2026 State of the Union Address. I ask you to welcome our modern James Madison.
Well, after receiving such effusions, I always feel compelled to remind the audience that nothing that John said was under oath. But this evening is not a time for lightness. The only comparable time in my years of experience in Washington, D.C., I still remember very vividly, October 20th, 1973, the Saturday Night Massacre. I was then involved in researching impeachable offenses under the aegis of the Attorney General. That hadn't been done for 100 years since Andrew Johnson had been impeached in 1868. And one of my former law professors at Harvard Law School, Archibald Cox, had subpoenaed White House tapes to show the obstruction of justice after the burglary at the Watergate. And Mr. Nixon wanted Mr. Cox to be fired as his position as special prosecutor, something that the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, promised he would not do. And so on that evening of October 20th, there's a phone call from the White House over to the Justice Department. Alexander Haig, your commander-in-chief, has given you an order. Right? It reminds you of a country of which we need not speak tonight. said, well, that's an order, but it's illegal, and I'm not complying with the order. The firing occurred anyway after the Attorney General at that time, Mr. Richardson, and Mr. Ruckelshaus resigned. And I remember seeing Robert, he was a CBS reporter. Robert, I forget his last name. He's on the White House lawn. And he said, with great alarm, this is the burning of the Reichstag. The FBI had sealed the offices of the special prosecutor, so it was shut down. And I remember thinking, well, does this republic have a long shelf life? And the center held people like you and me, and like the tank man in Tiananmen Square, stood up and said, no, we still have a rule of law. The president is not the law, he's under the law, despite risks. The center held for one reason, because people like you lobbied Congress, screamed and yelled peacefully, we don't have a king. That is why Congress responded, because the telegrams were tens of thousands saying whether they were Republican or Democrats. On July 4, 1776, we fought against a king, not to make a king. Fought against a king even when the 56 signatories signed their death warrants to assert unalienable rights against King George III. Signed their death warrants. So I believe that is where we are today. In fact, I believe the peril is far greater because we have a president who is totally unembarrassed by openly acknowledging and boasting. There's nothing, not the Constitution, nothing in the world that constrains me other than what I want to be constrained by. His moral conscience, which is kind of an oxymoron when you address the current occupant of I say it, for Mr. Trump to acknowledge that his only restraint is his moral conscience is an oxymoron, since there is no moral conscience in Mr. Trump. He's obviously narcissistic. Now, it is certainly true that he's not the first one to abuse executive power. You can go back to 1950, Harry Truman fought the Korean War without any authorization from Congress. He had his loyalty program, violated First Amendment rights, seized steel mill in 1952, said at that time if he needed to, he could censor newspapers to fight the war. But we're surely at a new level of magnitude and brazenness when there's no effort to even make a passing salute to the Constitution. Remember earlier, Mr. Trump told NBC News, no, he really didn't think he had to comply with this oath of office. This is in Article 2, where he can't even come to the White House unless he pledges to preserve, defend, and protect the Constitution of the United States. Now, let me just briefly kind of survey the areas where the Constitution is flagrantly violated. First of all, the declare war clause. He uses the military. He has done so in sometimes as a direct belligerent, as in Venezuela. He's threatened to do that in Greenland, but maybe he's going to go to Iceland because he mistook Greenland for Iceland 4 times. Maybe he'll go some other place, and he's clearly stated that he does not need any congressional authority. He doesn't even talk to Congress. Not only does not he have any authority, he says, I didn't even alert them. I alert the oil companies before, because that's what I really care about. So a complete usurpation of the war power, but that has been continued. That's not necessarily so new. But we also have him totally trampling, freedom of speech and press. He's using government to penalize, disadvantage anybody who holds a viewpoint that he doesn't like, whether it's schools, whether it's students, whether it's lawyers. That's not how the system works. In fact, the greatest speech that needs the greatest protection is speech that does criticize government. It has to be peaceful avenues of redress. We don't defend incitement, but that's part of what it means to be America. I mean, how did we get to July 4, 1776 without protest, the stamp tax, the Boston Tea Party, or whatever? You can't have a democratic or any kind of self-government without vigilantly protecting that freedom of speech. And it's obvious as well that Mr. Trump is using the Justice Department to attack, his political enemies. I think some of these things, like going after Jerome Powell because he overspent remodeling the Fed, You go into the Oval Office, it's gold-plated, the ballroom, whatever. You're really concerned about, well, he brought some curtains that had too much lace on them. I mean, it's obvious what's going on. He's not really very good at disguising his ulterior motives, which are all illicit, which basically says, I just do whatever I feel like doing. Congress has no role. He doesn't spend money that Congress appropriates. He says, that's just my authority under the Impoundment Control Act. Sometimes he spends money that Congress hasn't even appropriated. For example, he's already said he's sold maybe $500 million of Venezuelan oil, which he says we own, because we decided that they used our technology at some point and couldn't nationalize the oil companies there. That we, at the same time that we are nationalizing companies here, like Intel and others, we own 10% of that. We tell NVIDIA, you can only export your semiconductor chips to China if you give us 25% ransom. We own golden shares in U.S. Steel, so we tell this company when you can open a plant and close it. I mean, this is exactly what we're condemning, other countries doing. And so we have a president, in my judgment, completely contemptuous of the separation of powers, the rule of law, and we can't claim that we don't know what's going on. It's all in plain view. Can anyone, unless you're Ichabod Crane and sleeping for 20 years, can't see exactly what's being asserted? The people around him. Mr. Trump boasts, I am a king. He celebrates on social media, on the internet, pictures of him wearing a crown. He says, this 250th year celebrating the Declaration of Independence, he doesn't understand. We fought against a king, not for a king, on July 4th. It was King George III, who didn't even at that time exercise powers over the colonists with unchecked authority as much as Mr. Trump does today. There is really nothing in Mr. Trump's playbook that wouldn't enable him to arrest anyone in this auditorium today. Say, well, you criticize me, you're interfering with our ability to carry foreign policy. Well, I've decided not only does the citizenship clause of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment not apply to persons born in the United States to parents who aren't here with authority, but it doesn't apply to anybody who opposes me. Why is that? I decided. So, you can't question me. There's no judicial review. Whatever I say is the law, and he uses an executive order. Now, people think, well, that goes too far. Well, again, let's go back to the country that we dare not mention. That's what's said at that time, too. Power falls off a cliff. There are no limits. And when you have someone who feels that there are no limits, like Napoleon, he marches to Moscow. Who knows what craziness could be? Does anyone here a year ago believe Trump would have said the things he said about Greenland? I just need to own it. Why do you need to own it? Well, I feel better if I have a grasp of it in my hands, I don't want a treaty, an agreement. That's not good enough. I just have to feel ownership. I mean, this is a 3-year-old thinking he has to own the lollipop or something. And I say these things because I have such gratitude for ancestors who sacrificed so much for so long at such risks so that we could be here today and speak. I'm really, right now, playing James Madison. One of the obligations in the Constitution is for the president to deliver a State of the Union message and to make recommendations to Congress. We don't there's no constitutional authority under which we live today. Mr. Trump does whatever he wants. Now, Mr. Madison understood that presidents might be inclined, after George Washington, to act in such a despotic fashion. That's why we had separation of powers. That's why the lion's share of authority in the Constitution is entrusted to the Congress of the United States. Not because they have higher morals, not because they're smarter necessarily in the present, but because they have different incentives. The institutional personality is one of deliberation. You have to get a consensus. You have to move toward an Aristotelian mean. And most of the time it's open, it's in the sunshine, not in the White House where you have all this classified information. And you ask yourself, why is it that Congress does nothing? It's remarkable. I'm up there 2 or 3 times a week. How, what I call droopy and weak. Well, we can't do anything. You can do something. It doesn't mean to be successful overnight. Speak up. Call a spade a spade. And you have to recognize, too, that the seeds of much of this authority, not all of it, was planted by Democratic presidents, too. And we need to get back and be honest that we have been, an empire for almost 100 years. We have renounced the founding principles of why we became a country at all. One, that's perhaps the most important. We are the only country in the history of the world that was born under the idea it's more important that a few wrongdoers escape justice than the innocent suffer. The burden of proof is on the government. That is the highest governmental principle ever conceived in the history of the world. No other country believed that. If you look at Great Britain, for example, Magna Carta, well, you're kind of grabbing power from the king who otherwise is omnipotent. We said, no, the power lies in us. We're putting manacles on you, not the other way around. And think how important that principle is. A presumption of innocence. No, ICE can't go arrest people without any proof that you're here illegally or wrongfully. Violates the Fourth Amendment. Unfortunately, because Congress has done nothing, there's no disincentives. You can't, if you're an ICE member, why do you care whether you violate the Constitution? There's no sanction. You don't get prosecuted. No one can sue you. You're immune. The state authorities can't go after you because you're performing a federal function. All these loopholes, if you will, they're there because Congress sits idle. Idle, does nothing. So, and to that extent, I don't want to mitigate, Mr. Trump pushes, doesn't have any pushback. Well, why isn't he going to do the equivalent of Napoleon marching to Moscow? He may end up with Waterloo, maybe, if Congress stands up. But the reason why I mention this is because the remedy is us. The remedy is us. Doesn't mean you have to devote your total life. You got to speak right in to your members of Congress, emails, make a phone call. It doesn't have to be 24 hours a day. You got to register. This is wrong. This is not our country. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we treat people differently here. Otherwise, I can tell you, we do not have a Congress that on its own, without being pushed, is going to do anything. They're not going to run to the barricades. They're not going to be like Tank Man. They won't. Now, there is encouraging signs to show that public authority, public persuasion, still has a role to play. In 2013, President Obama wanted a declaration of war against Syria. The members of the public said, we don't want to go there. We've seen Iraq, we've seen Afghanistan, had it. They wouldn't even vote the bill out of committee on the Senate side. Wouldn't even vote the bill out of committee. In 1998, 1999, Bill Clinton asked Congress for a declaration of war against Serbia. No. Congress wouldn't vote on it. So he said, well, I'll just go to war on my own and simply call it not war. Right? So we now have this Orwellian concept that, and it's bought into by both Republicans and Democrats, that if our attackers are at a sufficient altitude that they're not threatened to being shot down, or nobody on the U.S. side is threatened, then we can destroy the world, dropping bombs, nukes, or whatever, and it's not war. If only the other side dies and not us, because we have more weapons and sophistication. I said, really? So that means Hiroshima wasn't an act of war because Paul Tibbets was at a high altitude and they couldn't shoot him down? Incinerating 120,000 men, women, and children is not an act of war. But that's kind of the regime that we live under at present. It takes George Orwell's to a new level, the way in which language has been so debased, where it's commonplace now, and there's very little pushback in the media to say by the administration, and Congress says, yeah, we are under today an invasion by Venezuela. An invasion by Venezuela? We blockade them, we go in, abduct their president, say we're going to stay there forever, and Venezuela's invading the United States. That's the theory upon which no due process is being given to immigrants in the United States of any Venezuelan background. You just shake your head and say, wow. I thought the Mad Hatter's Tea Party in Alice in Wonderland was fiction, but I was wrong. We're seeing it every day. And I want to underscore, this is not I do not believe, that Mr. Trump is responsible for all the evils. This is built into the corruption and decay of our culture. The corruption and decay that's led to weakness, to people who would rather be comfortable than to live under a system where we give dignity to everybody, that we don't permit any government official to attack, to degrade, to disadvantage anyone except for their behavior or their character. That's it. And I go back again to the time I'm James Madison, and he was president at the creation. He was age 25. It's unfortunate we don't have younger people. He was struggling at age 25, the Continental Congress, the Virginia Council of Revision. He's drafting the Constitution at age 36. And their lives were on the line. They were fighting the biggest empire then existing on the globe, the British. And when they're in the Revolutionary War, they outmanned us in terms of numbers, 3, 4, 5 to 1. This is comparable to our presence in Vietnam. John knows about that very well since he ran a senior thesis on this. 500,000 troops, all the most sophisticated weapons, we still lost, right? Because it was their country. So I feel that whether or not we succeed, and it may be that we will not, Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention said that there may come a time, although he supported the Constitution, he said, well, it really depends on the people willing to fight and defend the ideas and principles behind it. And he says, and if it plunges to despotism, it's because that's all the people can live under is despotism. They no longer are worthy of self-government. And that's the challenge every generation has to face. I look really back at my Watergate days and say, compared to today, it's just stunning, how the liberties have been forfeited, how Congress has done nothing, and the public is so complacent. Now, I'm not here to give report cards. I'm here to tell you what the State of the Union is, and it's more than alarming. It's frightening to think, what are we going to tell our posterity? That they're going to inherit a despot? Because there's another thing that I've omitted. No president has ever surrendered power back to the power he inherited from a predecessor. It's not going to happen. If President Trump leaves, the successor is not going to say, well, here, you can have the power back. No. The only way there will be power taken back is if, through our representatives and lobby them, Congress forces the change through statutes, through impeachment, the power of the purse, and takes the power back. It's either going to be that way or not at all. Now, we have a tendency, because we have short lifespans and don't really understand history very much, to think that it can't happen to us. We've lived 250 years since the Declaration. That's the blink of an eye compared to the infinite time that probably the galaxy has existed. But don't worry, all empires believe that they'll be around forever. The Winston Churchill, the turn of the century in 1900. That's just the nature, of the species and empires. But let's try, if we can, to make this an exception. July 4, 1776 was an exception. September 17th, 1787, a miracle at Philadelphia was an exception. We can be exceptions, but that's what it is. And the reason why it's an exception is because it doesn't come naturally to the political kingdom. It's there as an exception because we have an especially gifted, resolute, far-sighted people willing to take risks. And I hope that we can vindicate that. But whether or not we can succeed in the short run, we also need to lay down principles, standards, even if it doesn't come about for 100 to 200 years, to which the wise and honest may repair. If we have to speak to the future, so be it. It may well be that we don't survive this particular crisis that John has underscored. And that's really why I'm here, to encourage everyone. If we have to go to the barricades, we go to the barricades. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope we can push back through all peaceful avenues of redress, which comes first. But remember those haunting words in the Declaration of Independence. When a leader whose every act evinces a desire to reduce you to despotism, that's the time you have to change the dispensation. Anyway, those are my remarks, and eager to answer questions, especially as to what we can do, exercising our right to petition for redress of grievances. I do not think this is it shouldn't be an anti-Trump exercise, although he happens to be the occupant at present. I myself have drafted and circulated on the Hill what I call contingent articles of impeachment, saying basically, no, we're not against Mr. Trump the person, we're against Mr. Trump when he violates the Constitution, and if he makes redress by issuing executive orders, walking in this way back, he gets to stay in office. Because our goal is compliance with the Constitution, not vendettas against any particular individual. See whether we have any traction of that sort. If I want to be candid, I'm not overly optimistic, but that really doesn't make any difference. You have to do the right thing whether you're optimistic or not. That's what Socrates teaches all of us, emancipating the mind and the character from the attitude of complacency, docility, and oppression. And I go back, it's not me. I think about those 250 years ago, those bold, those smart, those courageous people who risked a lot without air conditioning and a lot of hardship that they confronted. And we owe them a debt of gratitude to try to emulate that example. That's what I concluded.
Hi, I've heard that Gerald Celente is starting a new party, and it's like a peace party. Have you heard about that party? Would you be interested in joining that?
I apologize, I'm not sure I understood.
There's a peace party.
Oh, the peace party. Yeah. But see, I believe that what Madison would say, it's not, the peace party is the Constitution party. If you enforce, and it's a good opportunity to elaborate on why, when the Constitution has been followed, namely that only the Congress can authorize the offensive use of the military, that's happened only 5 times, 5 conflicts in 200 and some years, and only when Congress had concluded that an aggressor had already broken the peace, because Madison knew Congress is not, it's by nature an institution. It knows it loses power during wartime because it all gravitates to the commander-in-chief. So if you're the peace party, you're really the party of the Constitution. And the party of back here says, make Congress, it doesn't have to make it great again, it just has to exercise the instruments that have already been entrusted to it for 250 years. They just need to wake up from their stupefaction.
Thank you. My name is Paolo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute. If I may ask you, since we're back to the days of the founders, another founder, John Adams, wrote, not exactly on constitutional matters, but saying, I think it was in his letter to the militia of Massachusetts, been quoted many, many times, that this republic is for moral people. Mm-hmm. And morality is the absolute precondition for all this to work. Otherwise, the Constitution will oppose the passions of the people in the same way as a net opposes a whale that goes through it. He uses this metaphor. Was he right? In other words, have we just been lucky for 250 years that the circumstances somehow, fortuitously, helped us to survive as a constitutional government, as you eloquently pointed out? Or is it inevitable that human beings being what they are and therefore falling short of the qualities of morality? Montesquieu said, the soul of democracy is virtue. If people are not virtuous, goodbye democracy. What's your take on this, Mr. Madison?
I think Mr. Madison would say that observation is incomplete. You obviously have to have some level of morality, because morality is what at least gives some legitimacy to laws. In Nazi Germany, we didn't even view the Nuremberg laws, even they went through the process, as being laws, because they were so horrendous. But where Madison, I think, would add to your observation is it's separation of powers that guarantees our liberty. You remember he says in Federalist 47, you need to have ambition against ambition. And he said, we wouldn't have government if men were angels. So he's saying, we're not relying upon morality. We're buying institutional checks and oversight. That's what we're relying upon. And he openly says, George Washington is one in 1,000 years, We're not building our institutions on a George Washington occupying the White House, because we know that's not going to be the case. And even John Adams himself, he's president, he signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were contrary to what he was defending in prior years, because the criticism he was receiving, I guess, he was rather thin-skinned. So the fact is that, yeah, there has to be at least some level of morality, but it's pretty thin. Madison and our institutions were there because we understood morality isn't enough. Without the checks and balances, it's going to descend into despotism. And that's basically what Ben Franklin said at the Constitutional Convention. And so that's what I'd say. So why have we been able to continue as long as we have with separation of powers in tatters? And I think it's because we still live in the architecture of James Madison. The Constitution is still there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to actually exercise the powers and have the checks work as they're supposed to work, because the checks don't operate by spontaneous combustion. Human beings have to get up and do something. And when our outlook and concept of the United States shifted, at least at the time of the Spanish-American War, from, as articulated by John Quincy Adams, the glory of the United States is liberty, the march of the mind, not the march of the foot soldier. Then by the time of the Mexican-American War, manifest destiny that even Trump, wait a minute now, liberty? No, we have to rule the world. First it's the continent, then it goes to Latin America, then it goes globally. And it's the nature of empires that you can't have liberty, because you need a Caesar to run an empire, whether it's de facto or de jure. If you look at the British Empire, we oftentimes associate parliamentary supremacy. That's the British system, different than ours. Read British history. All you read about is prime ministers. Read about World War II. You know one person, Winston Churchill. Nobody else. They didn't even have elections, right? Because they're running an empire. So you have to have one. That's it. Even Gladstone, when he was prime minister, he campaigned on wanted to downsize the empire. He didn't downsize anything. He acquired Egypt because the whole institutional empire required all the decision-making to be lodged there. And that's why, in some sense, we need to re-examine our premises and understanding of why we were different. Now, I believe that we have been in this process of decay over a long period of time, and part of that is because we're competing against other countries that are all despotisms too, at least since the rise of manifest destiny, which was the intellectual or philosophical attack on liberty, the right to march to your own drummer, being the premise of our distinctiveness as a country. The rule of law is everything. No, we don't need to conquer other people. We influence by example. As manifest destiny is a concept devoid of any intellectual substance. Manifest to who? It wasn't manifest to Mexico that we're going to go to invade and conquer, 3/4 of the country. But it's a slow accretion of that. Now, it is perhaps, however, destined to reach where we are today. And I make that observation for this reason. It was at least relatively easy at the time of the founding to embrace these concepts of restraint, because we're 3 or 4 million people. We don't really have any armed forces. We couldn't be a global empire anyway, right? So to resist it took very little resisting temptation, because it really wasn't there. The temptation becomes overwhelming by the end of the 1800s, because we're the industrial power of the world. We're past Germany and England, tons of steel. We have a big Navy that Teddy Roosevelt loves, and we have Alfred Mayon says the importance of the Navy to run around the world and conquer everyone. So then the temptation was more than academic. It was real, and we succumbed. That's what we decided, hey, let's be the empire. The white man's burden, which was an odd, it really wasn't a burden. We actually took slave labor and used it, although we didn't call them slaves, in all these foreign countries, in order to enhance our economy and defend these foreign investments in other countries. And so that's why I believe that this has been slow deterioration, and we need, in some sense, we need to rewrite our textbooks and rewrite what we tell our kids around the table. We're not an empire. We weren't born as an empire. We don't want to be an empire. We want to influence by example. And again, the greatness of the United States goes back. Presumption of innocence. We'd rather have a few escape accountability to make sure no innocent suffers ever. That's what, we are the opposite of that now. Just look on TV where ICE is. You think they carry a presumption of innocence? They grab anybody they want. And there's no deterrent. The laws aren't sanctioning any of this. So you can understand why ICE would do this. There's no downside risk, and I get a bonus for every 3 people I arrest or something of that sort. But I say our obligation, because we are living on the intellectual capital, the courage of ancestors, we got to try our best to display gratitude. It means we got to do likewise. That's it. There isn't any other choice in my mind.
So people think that Trump won by landslide. He didn't. You know, the difference between Kamala Harris and Trump was not that big, and then most of the people didn't vote because they didn't want either of them. But I think Citizens United is what really has built this party system that we have today. Infinite money can go on either side. And so we don't have any Howard Bakers today. The 4 or 5 people who went to tell Nixon he didn't have the votes in the Senate. So, and then I think that clearly Trump played upon Christian nationalism and racism to build his support. We're in a tough place because we have these people who are fearful of the other people. We've got unlimited money going into the parties to influence the outcome. Where do we go? How do we get out of this situation?
Well, I've said that we basically have degenerated into plutocracy. If you look at the platform which Trump was sworn in January 20th of 2025, it's like $3 trillion there, you know, the heads of Apple and Google and Meta and all these others. But I think that you may be overstating the importance of Citizen United. It's true, I mean, money began to be very, very dominant as far back as 1900. You may recall a very famous statement made by Mark Hanna. He was William McKinley's campaign manager. And he remarked, there's 2 things really, really important in politics, he said. The first one is money, and I've already forgotten what the second one is, right? That's the Gilded Age. So it's been around. But I believe that the money is more the symptom than the cause of the deterioration of our democratic dispensation. The reason why money is important is because the government gets into 5 million things. It's running your business directly or indirectly through regulation. If it didn't, why would these companies throw in these staggering amounts of money for the ballroom, for the inaugural celebrations for Trump? It's because they figure they're going to get something in return. Monetary, the bottom line. Because the government, at this stage, 200,000 regulations, every nook and cranny of your life somehow has a connection with the government. And if you want to get money out of politics, you just need to downsize the government to what its true obligation should be, to make sure that everyone can march to their own drummer. I do believe in a social safety net, to make we are rich enough to make sure no one, no matter how poor, just because you're born, is taken care of. That's an obligation, and we can surely discharge that with a tiny fraction of our military-industrial complex budget. We give people second chances, but otherwise, we let people decide for themselves how they want to be fulfilled. And we don't care whether we have an empire. We get 800 military bases abroad. We're arguing about Iceland and Greenland and in Venezuela, Colombia, and all these. This is ridiculous. We obviously have influence by example, but that's it. Why are we telling them how to run their countries? We can't even run our own country well. It's a very, very big challenge. So I'm just thinking that, yes, Citizens United, I think, was wrongly decided, but I think that is just the surface of a deeper problem, which is government is way, 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 way too big. We need checks and balances, and to the extent that government is involved, it should be to help more of the disadvantaged. And I say it's not going to bankrupt the United States by any means. It'd be a decimal point on what the Pentagon spends every hour.
What are 3 actions that are urgently needed, and by whom? What are 3 actions urgently needed, and by whom?
You said, what are the 3 actions needed by? Yeah,
That
they're
are
all
urgently needed and by whom? Yes, sir.
They're all by Congress. I mean, the first thing that I would do, and I've sent up so many draft bills, it's a very simple statute. No monies of the United States can be expended to utilize the military of the United States offensively, except in response to an actual attack, unless Congress has declared war, right? It's very simple. In fact, it's done before on a narrower scale to end the Vietnam War. In 1973, Congress passed a statute that said, after August 15th, 1973, no monies of the United States may be expended to conduct combat operations over Indochina. Ended the war. There was no money, right? The second thing that I would do if I were that I believe is important, this is because we need to regularize and give more due process to the whole idea of impeachment. One, we need total tutorials. Impeachment is not the guillotine of the French Revolution. It's not sending Khrushchev to Siberia. Impeachment is like Donald Trump on Apprentice. We fire the CEO because he's not doing his job. That's what it is. This is no criminal penalty. So we need to have Congress introduce, and again, I've drafted legislation, say these are the things that we find impeachable offenses. They don't have to be crimes: spending money without authority, going to war, having executive agreements rather than treaties, legislating through regulation rather than through Congress. So there's fair warning, right? And it could be a deterrent. But that's, you can't have impeachment be credible when it degenerates to what then Minority Leader of the House, Gerald Ford, said in 1970, impeachable offense is whatever you convince a majority of the House at any time, even if it's expectorating on the sidewalk. That can't be true, right? And it really degrades the sobriety of the whole exercise of impeachment. And then the last thing that I would do is I believe that an enormous amount of the abuse would be deterred by transparency. Remember this famous line of Louis Brandeis: sunshine is said to be the best of disinfectants, the electric lamp the most effective policeman. So you have to have Congress basically tell the president, you cannot keep anything secret from us. If we need to do it in executive session, we will. We don't want to publicize our location of our forces in times of war, but we decide, not you, what gets made public. Transparency is essential to deterring wrongdoing and let the American people know exactly what's going on. So we don't wait for Daniel Ellsberg to leak the Pentagon Papers. Congress should have that already. I mean, of course, one of the ironies, and a little bit desultory here, is Daniel Ellsberg did go to Congress to deride him to publish the Pentagon Papers. It ended up in the New York Times and Washington Post because even J. William Fulbright and Chuck Mathias, Nelson, and these other purported liberals were scared. Really, even though they had speech or debate clause immunity. So I would have a statute saying everything that we ask for, you need to give to us. A former CIA director, George Tenet, he testified for the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Congress is far better at keeping secrets than the executive branch, which leaks like a sieve. The Congress kept the Manhattan Project secret, right? So if they can keep the Manhattan Project secret, they can keep others secret. There may be an occasional abuse. But that, I say, is so important. Government in the sunshine is going to solve at least half of the problems of abuse that we have right now. Those would be the 3 most important things. And it's not, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I've drafted bills and say, here it is. All you got to do is introduce it. But, they get distracted 15 other ways, and they're all making political calculations as to, well, this looks like it hasn't been done before. And, that's deadly in the United States of America. It hasn't been done before. Well, I keep telling them, before Copernicus and Galileo, everybody stood up and said, the Earth really is not the center of the universe. Were you going to oppose them because it hadn't been done before? This is a way to fossilize civilization.
Thank you. So more pragmatically, what you said, the only note I took from your presentation was that the remedy is us. So beyond what Julius just asked, what actions can we take? We're not going to go about doing the impeachment piece. We're not going to, of course, transparency is a good idea, but it's not an action.
It is an action if Congress passes the statute.
It's an action, but I'd like to hear from you. Well, I'd like to hear from you actions for us to take besides voting, because I feel like there's a huge intimidation, a trust deficit around all of us, but yet where is the leadership to tell me what to do, where to write, what to say, what's the message, what are the ideas that we should be promoting, actions. I mean, we can talk about this all night, but I'd like to hear your ideas about specific actions for us to take that we could actually maybe have an impact. Thank you.
Well, it's a wonderful question. You're right. This is more than academic. Let me describe what I do. I have an assistant every single day. We go up to members of Congress. Here's the statute. Here's draft articles of impeachment. We think you do X, Y, Z. We can give tutorials to your staff, but you need to act here. Otherwise, this country is going to capsize. And it's not like it used to be immediately after January 6th. You can go into the offices. They're open. It's not like the White House where you got to go through 85 security clearance. And that has an impact. Now, I can't say that you're going to revolutionize anything overnight, but that's what you can do. You can visit, and if you're not in Washington, you can go to the local district office, and it makes a difference. I had two sons that did internships with senators and members of the House. This was years ago, however, but it said if somebody shows up, they gave great weight, 5, 10 times more weight than if they get a postcard that looks like it's a robo machine, throw it off. Because they figure you're a proxy, you're the tip of the iceberg of people's misunderstanding. So people say, well, that seems so small. It isn't small. You got to take an effort. And so, if you want something to distribute, you can look at my website. I have drafted everything 15 times over. Modify it. That's what is needed. That is action. You show up, you care enough to go into the office. You're not rambunctious, you're not rude. You say, we really think that this is very serious, and you'd like to sit down and talk and say, this is how you can get my vote the next time around, and then their ears will unbutton when you talk about voting. But again, it sounds so simple, right? But yet, that's how self-government works. And if it doesn't work the first time, you go in a second time, or you go in a third time, or you go in a fourth time. That's what it means, to have institutions respond to public opinion. We don't have referendums. We can't, do Gallup polls. But and I can guarantee you, the offices are open. The 3 buildings on each, the House and the Senate side. I live right behind the James Madison Library by choice, and it's very, very simple to do.
Okay, Bruce, the next question comes from Ted Daly, who's on the Zoom call. So, Bruce Fein, I've discovered a flaw in the U.S. Constitution. Why is it the case that Congress, through impeachment, can only remove the president for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors? The 25th Amendment empowers the cabinet and the VP to remove the president if, quote, unable to discharge the powers and duties of office, physical or mental. Shouldn't Congress possess some power to make a judgment that a president has gone crazy and remove him from, inter alia, the ability to push the nuclear button?
I think that all these questions are wonderful. I say there's never bad questions, but I think it misapprehends the 25th Amendment, which provides at least temporary or maybe longer disability or replacement of the president. It's initiated by the executive branch. Congress doesn't even get off of first base unless a majority of the cabinet members, and you can imagine Trump's cabinet members are going to say that he's crazy, and that's not going to happen. So impeachment, in contrast, is an entire congressional exercise. No executive involvement, no judicial review, nothing. That's why I don't believe that there's any tension between the 25th Amendment and the impeachment power.
Hi. I just wanted to ask your thoughts on filibuster reform, and if you think that that would make Congress work more effectively, or we should still aim for that bipartisan agreement.
Yeah. Well, filibuster reform always raises the issue, is the cure worse than the disease? And if you look at least, the fabric of the Constitution's separation of powers, clogs on simple majorities were largely applauded because there was a distrust of simple majority rules. As Jefferson said, we don't want to have 300 elected despots rather than one. Now, that doesn't mean that occasionally filibusters can block very urgent legislation. It happened during the Civil Rights Movement. Ultimately was overcome. So I believe that Mr. Madison would have said, yeah, he would have supported the filibuster because it's an additional check on majority rule. It's like so many things in politics, it's a balance. You want an equilibrium here. In knowing, especially today with AI and the mass media and the ability of the digital age to sway opinions in radical ways very quickly, I think that the filibuster on net does more good than harm.
Hi, Bruce. Thank you very much. We had a good question over here about actions. And if I remember correctly, at the end of your talk, you were advocating going to the barricades if we must. And my question is to you, what did you mean by going to the barricades? Does that mean pulling another 1776? And what would that look like?
Yeah. Well, let's hope we don't have to do that. But that's, in fact, what 1776 was about. We did not win our independence except by resorting to force. And I understand it's a good challenge, to draw the line between we still have peaceful avenues of redress. I'm against violence except in self-defense. But the Declaration of Independence itself says that when a ruler, all whose actions evince a design to reduce you to despotism, and over long periods of time have turned a deaf ear to every remonstrance made through peaceful means, what else is there? You're basically rewarding someone by saying, as long as you become sufficiently despotic, we'll go ahead and lie down. I don't think if that were the case, we would never fought July 4th, 1776. The Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, they used rifles. They used force to oppose the British. It didn't happen, they didn't march out on, but only after they exhausted all of the alternatives. And we were trying to get our rights in peaceful means. You're not paying any attention to us, and that's all we have to do. So going to the barricades means that if we come to that point, that's the only way we can survive as a people. Otherwise, we'll be reduced to serfs. And we know what that means by looking around the country where people do live as serfs in Russia and China and elsewhere. And as far as I'm concerned, like Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth. If I have to live as a serf, go ahead and kill me. Just like I would want to be taken off of life support if I have no brain anymore. Now, let's hope we don't go their way. I mean, part of the reason why we exist is to try to forestall that very, very grim decision. But it has to be made at some point if the situation calls for the same. Very last effort.
Bruce, following up on the previous discussion about what one as an individual can do, what organizations could one send money to? I mean, what sort of organizations would you recommend that one support financially?
Yeah, the Campaign Legal Center is worthy recipient. I'm trying, at least at present, to develop what I call a nonprofit will devote develop a war room that does nothing but spend time thinking about these issues and try to have the checks that are enduring. I repeat, this is not just a Trump. If we just get rid of Trump without going after the structure, we're going to have a Trump 2.0. I can guarantee you. No successor is going to give back the elements voluntarily. But I don't know. There is a group in Boston, I think For the People, that's gathering statistics and trying to get petitions calling for impeachment. I say to some degree, I get a little bit anxious because you got to have it's most important that you have to know why. Just to scream you don't like the guy and impeach them, you're going to come back with the same problem. You have to understand the principles that justify the impeachment and make sure that they don't return again. But if you email me, I will think about other institutions. We're trying to now perhaps create 1 or 2 days, maybe at the National Press Club, citizen impeachment hearings with a mock Senate, just as an educational effort to try to get this understood widely. So the people need to know what the stakes are. And I sound like a broken record, but constitutional illiteracy is a very great danger. And you can talk, and John mentions, well, okay, you're going to say the Constitution is my playbook. But if you don't know what it means, all it is words, right? And it doesn't carry any substance because you don't really know what you're talking about. So, I mean, I could say equals MC squared, but I don't really know anything that Einstein knew. And that's why the educational mission is so important. But again, if you work with Oliver, get in my email. I'll give you some names.
Thank you very much for your comments. I went to school in the 60s and 70s, and there was such an undercurrent of anger and action that seems to be missing from the college age today. And I find that curious because I'm sure that they're as outraged about Greenland as I am, but we don't seem to have any, there doesn't seem to be that undercurrent of anger visible as it was in the late 60s and 70s with Vietnam. I just wanted to
Yes,
know.
I feel that very prominently, too. That's why, in some sense, I compared the country's reaction to Watergate and the Saturday Night Massacre to what we see today, which is unbelievable complacency. Now, because in most serious issues have more than one cause, multi-cause. But I think that one of the reasons why there's such placidity today is because, in an ironic sense, after the Soviet Union disintegrated, we've said, hey, we got all the angelic DNA, we're God's new chosen people, we do whatever we want. It doesn't matter anymore, because we won. And started to run victory laps. This is before the stupidities and expanding NATO and going into all these other countries, spending trillions of dollars. And it was that hubris, if you will, that lowered the moral dimension, if you will, the fact that we had some introspection before. I mean, in some sense, the Soviet rivalry made us more tuned to what our own defects were because we were competing for loyalty in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. Soviet Union went away, what do we need to do? We don't care anymore. So I believe that's one reason why. There wasn't any competition that forced us to be more introspective and make certain that we satisfied certain standards. But part of it, too, simply may be that after the Soviet Union disintegrated, it really wasn't the character of the people changed, just that, hey, it's natural for human beings when you give them limitless power and there's no consequences for running abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and you have no philosophy in your culture. Hey, it gives you an adrenaline high. Hey, this is great. We'll go into this country today, tell them to do X, Y, Z. We'll overthrow Diem one day and Allende the next day, and we'll do Baby Shah on the next day. I mean, it's, I have to laugh with regard to, the Baby Shah is supposed to go back in Iran. His father was the horrendous person who ended up, after Mossadegh, the only elected prime minister in the history of the Middle East, and then we ended up with the mullahs, and we're going to do the same thing again. And you really think that those Iranian protesters are not being funded by the CIA? Forget it. CIA is everywhere. And the baby Shah, he's hated by all the Iranians because of all of the kleptomania of his father. But that's another issue. But as I said, it goes back to the larger issue, why the complacency? And maybe it is inevitable. But even if it is inevitable, I just feel that we have an obligation to resist, even if we're crushed. Tank Man didn't know whether he's going to be crushed. We need to act like Tank Man. They push us, so be it. At least we had a reason to live.
To the gentleman who asked about where to send funds, I am serving as the treasurer of the committee, and so just to remind you, we are a 501c3, and so, I know you have, but thank you very much.
Yeah, but,
Hey, Bruce.
Yeah.
John Curley, retired U.S. Department of Treasury. Thank you so much. I think we have a moral problem here. We do have a constitution. We have a legal system that has existed. I jotted down a couple of notes. The founding fathers pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. They faced execution for treason, the loss of their family estates, exile, and historical oblivion if they failed. By contrast, our modern congressmen, office holders risk unfavorable press, loss of committee assignments, donor backlash, or primary challenges. My real question is, can a constitutional system designed by men who accepted mortal risk survive when it is stewarded by leaders whose highest fear is professional discomfort?
well, the answer is, can we survive? That's why we have this meeting tonight. It can happen. And I'm saying it more in an academic sense. So it happened in Watergate. Watergate hearings were held because the people said, no, the president is not above the law. And the telegrams came in. The reason why Bill Clinton, he couldn't get a declaration of war against Serbia because the American people said, we don't want to go into Serbia. We need invincible self-defense. The same thing happened to President Obama 2013 in Somalia. So the system still works. I remember even the first vote on the TARP program. The House voted it down. It was a bailout for big banks. And the response of Congress was the people writing in. I was in the congressional offices seeing the emails and the telephone calls, whatever, like 1,000 to 1 against this. Why the bailout? Not the people who are in default of their mortgage payments on their home, but all these big banks, AIG, $187 billion of payouts. And we have Frank Paulson, I remember at the time, Hank Paulson. He said, well, in this country, if you take leadership in time of crisis, even if I had no authority to do any of it, people will follow you. I said, really? No authority to do any of it? So I do think that we do have experience shows that it still is alive. The heart still beats a little bit. And we're the ones supposed to make it beat even louder. And even if it doesn't, we're setting a standard for our posterity to act upon if we have to resurrect the nation from the ashes.
I want to thank you for your comments. My name is Rashil Kachia. I'm a tech and policy student at the University of Maryland. I want to ask, Madison famously writes in Federalist 10 for the merits of plurality, and Washington famously is against political parties in their entirety. Do you believe that if more members of Congress were to individualize and diversify themselves from a party perspective, and stray away from a duopoly, do you think that Congress would be more inclined to take back their power?
The last portion of your question, I think, I couldn't hear completely. You think Congress would do what? What was the last? Would retrieve power? So,
if we were to stray away from a duopoly and, move on to more third parties, do you think that would empower members of Congress to, break away from voting on a line and take back their...
Sure, I do believe if they were... The members of Congress take one oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. They take no oath to support their political party. And you pointed out correctly at the time of Washington, there really weren't parties because he was so popular. Remember, he won every single electoral vote twice without any campaigns, without any publicity managers or anything. Remember what they said about Mr. Washington. He was a great general, and that made him a hero. But he was even a greater character that made him a legend. So as a legend, he didn't need campaign expenses. But then the parties started to emerge under John Adams, Jefferson, Madison. We did have a period, what's called the era of good feelings, through John Quincy Adams in 1824, but then we really divided into first the Whigs and the Democrats, and then the Republicans and Democrats since that time. I think that, and Madison said, it's impossible to just extinguish the tendency toward parties because factions love power. And his goal was to try to check all these factions through separation. And I think that if we just need to make the system work, as it was envisioned. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. People keep saying the Constitution is antiquated. It's not antiquated. We don't use it anymore. But ultimately, no system, no matter how good its structure, if the people become sufficiently debased and debauched, it's going to collapse. Even Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, if you give it to people who are completely incompetent, is not going to sound like the Ninth Symphony we know. And that's why I keep coming back. It's up to us, with our understanding, to try to restore the Constitution in operation as it's written.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Change is clearly needed. Change is clearly needed. For change, quality quality people that are dedicated to make change is absolutely vital. November 3rd are elections. I think it is vital for people to realize that there is a primary process, right? Make sure that you participate as actively as possible to make sure that you get quality candidates, not some, like Mr. Santos, remember that guy?
Yeah,
Yes.
George Santos. Yeah.
So this is, I think, very clean, very simple, very practical move that everybody needs to make if you want change. That's all.
No, I mean, basically the point is, if we want improved operation of Congress, we have to elect superior people to Congress. Now, that's something I spend a huge portion of my life trying to find people who are willing to put in the effort, whether Democrat or Republican or not aligned. It is very difficult, and even in our audience here, where are the young people? They don't exist. Maybe they're on TikTok or something. So they're more disengaged. But yeah, you have to go out and try to recruit them, but it is not easy, I can guarantee you, to recruit the people who are involved without any ulterior motives. They're not there to have their narcissism placated. They're there because they want to do the right thing for the country, and then willing to leave afterwards. And it's just talking to your friends. You got to run. You're younger. And that's how you get them involved. Say you're willing, and in some sense, the committee is eager, while we're 501c3, to say we'll certainly back you in public opinion if you want to dedicate a campaign to the United States Constitution. And unfortunately, and I've told Congress too, so many times, and they don't do anything. This is, again, one way in which we change the culture. In the 1950s and 60s, post-World War II, all of the academicians, the Arthur Schlesingers and the Newborns, and they all celebrated limitless executive power because they associated Congress with James Eastland and Richard Russell and the racist. And so all the books you get in the whole country, read textbooks, Congress doesn't even exist. No way. It's all the presidency. I said, Congress, you need to provide funds to write the history of Congress, when at the outset, it was the Congress that was the lead branch. It was the Daniel Websters. It was the Henry Clays. It was the John C. Calhouns. It was the Thomas Hart Bentons. John Quincy Adams left the White House to become a member of the House of Representatives and did his best work in the House, opposing the Mexican-American War and the gag order that prevented abolitionist petitions from being examined and addressed on the merits. So, but today, if you go through your typical civics test, you wouldn't even think Congress exists. You need to write and change those textbooks. You need to have a congressional college that teaches the Constitution. You need to have textbooks that you support that underscore why Congress is important. It's me. And remember this, what makes it even more disappointing. The House and the Senate, they appropriate money for their own budget. Doesn't have to clear the White House. The other branch doesn't get involved. I said, you have all the money. And both houses, I think, over the year, they spend collectively what the Pentagon spends every 10 minutes. I mean, it's nothing. They just sit and dawdle and totally uninterested. And this is how this changes, public opinion, changes the understanding of the central role of Congress. I mean, most citizens today, maybe they don't even know who their congressman is, really has no idea whether the Congress does anything or not anyway. They're largely wallpaper, and Congress acts that way. That has to change. And the beginning of the change is you got to write what the history of Congress is and why Madison and others gave them these powers and how it functioned properly until Congress then decided they would throw in the towel and become empire as well. I remember several years ago, I looked at the civics text in Virginia. They're called standards, SOLs, Standards of Learning. And I looked at it, so I wrote out a 10-page, single space, and I shared it with John, critique saying this is fine, but why is everything about the president? You're misrepresenting what congressional powers are. Nothing. They're totally uninterested in even debating the issue. That has to be repeated over and over and over again, because most people today growing up, they've never even lived in a world other than a world where the person in the White House decided everything. They don't even think it could exist otherwise, including members of Congress. I was up there the other day in Mark Pocan's office. Mark is a very progressive Democrat from Wisconsin. He said, Bruce, we've already lost, psychologically, there's no way we can gain our power back. I said, well, all you got to do is write the law, get it passed. You got to start someplace. So that's a longer-term project, but it can easily be done. Congress has all the money to do this overnight. I said, I recruit 20 people instantly. We'll write these histories and why Congress is important. Unfortunately, as Thomas Massey said in a different context, it's like reading Shakespeare to cows. Nothing happens.
So I'm going to piggyback on that because I think I agree with you with the institutions need to change, especially Congress. What do we do when the Congress is bought and paid for? So we have to change the laws that have to do with having due allegiance to other countries. We should not be allowing that, in my opinion. So I just wanted to know your opinion on that and how they take money from different interests and changing the laws on that. Because other than that, I'm thinking that a tax revolution is the only thing that we can resort to, is stop paying taxes to this very corrupt government that we're living under.
I apologize, I probably didn't absorb all of the question. The general idea was how can we diminish the influence of money in politics. Dual citizenship, well, first of all, what does dual citizenship mean? In the United States, it means that you can be a U.S. citizen as long as you state under oath that your prime loyalty is to the United States. If you claim that your loyalty is equal or more to another country, you're not a dual citizen. You can't be a dual citizen, okay? So now other countries don't require you to be loyal to them in order to have citizenship. They sell their citizenship so they can get into the EU or some ulterior motive to get money. And that's dual citizenship. So I don't think that's a real problem here. The money is a difficult issue because you have Supreme Court decisions that protect it as freedom of speech. And you have to remember that, by and large, the benefactors of the money are incumbents, and they're not likely to vote for a law that's going to diminish the benefits of incumbency because they're out for self-gratification. And that's why they would only do something like this if the people made it clear that was the only option. That's why I continue to believe that the more enduring and feasible way to diminish the role of money is downsized government. So the incentive to give falls, and then they don't do it anymore, because I can guarantee you the early elections in the United States, money was not a problem.
Hi, my name is Bert Wilson, and my question would be, if the root cause is the political parties, and they are both like each other, wouldn't it be better to try to start a third party and try to make a change? And what would be the obstacles there?
Okay, so third parties, yeah.
Well, I don't know whether the parties, I believe, are more the symptom of the disease rather than the cause of the disease. I think the primary cause is we've embraced this empire mentality where our adrenaline high comes from running around the world in search of monsters to destroy rather than celebrating, hey, let's let everybody march to their own drummer, free from fear of domestic predation or foreign aggression. And that by itself is the system. That's the greatness, is the process. We recognize the dignity of every individual. We obviously need self-defense. I call it invincible self-defense. Other people can't crush us. But I believe that's what, and you don't have to have a political party to win. George Washington didn't belong to a political party. He won every single electoral vote. You can run as an independent. Nothing that requires you to run by becoming a member of a party, which is what that's what I would support. I would never want my name attached to Democrats or Republican or anybody who believed that their loyalty might for a second be to the party rather than the Constitution. Constitution always comes first. And we can run a system without political. We did somewhat that during the era of good feelings. This was about 1808 to 1824. You only really had one political party at the time. There was internecine fighting. And that's what I would propose. But I think your right of association, gives people the right, if they want to join a political party, if they wish to. But I would try to dissuade them and say that's not the highest office of a self-governing people.
Bruce, thank you so much. This is great. Thank you.